So after the Soviets stopped going in 1976, there really was no mission to the moon for a very long time. Galileo spacecraft on its way to Jupiter flew past the moon in 1990, and the Japanese spacecraft Muse A flew by also in 1990, basically on the way to other places. And so they gave us our first close-up view of the moon in almost 2 decades. It really showed that we still had a lot to learn about the moon. Now, an interesting thing, though, is the serious trip back to the moon ended up being a military mission, the Clementine spacecraft in 1994. This was a Navy spacecraft, and so it was designed as a hardened spacecraft to survive, like a surveillance type spacecraft to survive nuclear blasts in low Earth orbit. Kind of radiation that would kill other things. So the engineers working on it said, well, why don't we just fly outside Earth's magnetosphere, then the sun can blast it, and we can practice seeing how does this work in harsh radiation. And that seemed like a good idea. So they said, well, we got to do something while we're out there. Why don't we just fly by the moon? And so they flew by the moon and started collecting data, which they made public, and it became very apparent that in 20 years, technology had made huge strides forward. In particular, military technology in the 1990s was wildly better than civilian technology in the 1970s. And so all of a sudden, it suddenly changed our understanding, because they found a variety of things on the surface of the moon that we had missed before, because now we had spectroscopic analysis that could show the minerals that were there. We realized, oh wait, the moon actually is really interesting. We really don't know everything about it yet. So 1998, NASA returns to the moon, the Lunar Prospector. Lunar Prospector orbited the moon, and as it was orbiting the moon, it was bouncing radar off the moon and so forth, and doing spectroscopic analysis, doing a mineralogical study. And several things here. When Clementine bounced radar off the moon, when it came back, it reflected off of the polar regions almost as if it was icy. And so this was supposed to investigate some of the ice at the lunar South Pole. Now, the moon's surface is pretty barren. It gets really hot in the daytime, and so the idea is there's no ice there. The rocks the astronauts brought back were pretty desiccated, very, very low water content, much drier than the driest Earth rocks. And so the idea was that the moon was totally barren of water. And yet the Clementine seemed to indicate there might be some ice. Now, one possibility is comets hit the moon, and the water vapor from the exploded comet settled into craters in the poles that the sunlight would never hit, and so they never warmed up, and so the water just froze there. And so the Lunar Prospector was designed to study that. Its results were very much inconclusive about ice on the moon. But we found that the moon is very rich mineralogically in minerals that are very rare on Earth and economically very, very valuable. That in modern technology uses certain kinds of minerals that are very rare on Earth, rare earth minerals we sometimes call these things, but they are necessary for semiconducting chips. And so in order to have computers and cell phones and computerized doodads all over the place, we need these minerals, and they're very rare on Earth, and yet Lunar Prospector found them very common on the surface of the moon. Well, since then, a variety of other spacecraft have gone to the moon. The SMART from the European Space Agency, Selene, which was a Japanese spacecraft, orbited the moon, Chang'e, and then, sorry, that should be Chang'e 2, Chang'e 1 and Chang'e 2 have been to the moon orbiting, and then more recently, a lander on the moon. So the China has actually landed on the surface of the moon with an unmanned lander on the far side of the moon. They were the very first ones to land on the far side of the moon. Everything else we've sent has been to the near side, but they land on the far side, and their orbiter is able to relay data back from the lander that landed on the far side. And so it's giving us a brand new view of the moon. Smart 1 used new technology called ion propulsion. I mentioned that with Deep Space One, which was American spacecraft, used ion propulsion to go to the asteroid belt. And it deliberately crashed into the moon, and you can actually see the impact site right there after it hit the moon. India launched a spacecraft to the moon in 2008, and so it orbited the moon, and this was the first. The second one came afterwards. But India has now joined the nations of sending things to the moon. And the spacecraft there actually discovered evidence of water on the surface of the moon in more places. More recently, we have the LCROSS and Lunar Reconnaissance orbiters that NASA satellites have gone to the moon. In fact, LRO has actually the first cameras with the resolution to see some of the landing sites from the Apollo astronauts. And so one of the big things conspiracy theorists say is, well, I don't see the landers when I look through a telescope, and you try to explain to them the physics of how resolution works, saying that you need a telescope almost a mile across in order to see landers from that far away, and they won't believe you. And they say, well, if the landers really were there, they'd have pictures of them. Well, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was the first spacecraft that had the resolution to take pictures, and it took pictures, and so now the conspiracy theorists say, oh, that's Photoshop. Okay. So they said they won't believe it, and that we went to the moon until there's pictures, and so now there's pictures, and they say, oh, I don't believe it. Okay. Even so, it just barely can see the landers in the pictures. So the landers just barely appear in the pictures, but there is evidence here that we went to the moon. Gravity recovered in Interior Laboratory, another recent NASA spacecraft, gone to the moon, orbiting. There's actually been some others here as well. Again, they orbit the moon here, and as they orbit, slight changes in the orbit due to structures inside the moon let them figure out where it's thick and thin on the surface, and so, again, helps us understand the interior of the moon. Now, all of this is part of an international sort of plan, a group of scientists got together and said, well, this whole idea of International Geophysical Year and International Polar Year, that was a really good idea. So we're going to declare an International Lunar Decade from 2017 to 2029. This is voluntary and non-binding of things, so it's not official, not like the previous things. It's just that what they want to do is have a lot of nations going to the moon and sharing data, so we're not all overlapping, the same kind of missions. And so it's a good idea. So far, there have been a bunch of missions to the moon. What's gone to the moon so far? The United States has launched 43 missions to the moon. 9 of them didn't work. Okay. The Soviet Union launched 48, but 19 of them didn't work. Russia hadn't launched any of their own separately, but they've worked with others going to the moon. Japan has launched 2 missions. European Space Agency has launched a mission. China's launched 5 missions. India 2 missions. Israel has launched a mission, but it crashed upon arrival. And LuxSpace, German mission, actually crashed on arrival too. It was actually tied in with the Israeli mission. So there are a variety of spacecraft that have gone to the moon, and that makes sense. It's the closest thing to us. Most recently here, the Chang'e 4 and the Yutu rover landed on the far side of the moon. They landed in 2019, on January of 2019, and has been moving around on the far side of the lunar surface collecting data and revolutionizing our understanding of the lunar surface, because it landed in a very unusual geological formation we'll talk about later, but that allowed us to see something entirely different, that nothing like that is present on the near side of the moon. And so it's given us a window into the moon we otherwise would not have had. At one point, NASA was planning going back to the moon with an Ares rocket, and they launched one in 2009, and I was actually there for the launch, but right afterwards they canceled the project. And so they stopped the project there, and then you know, this raises some questions about, going back to the moon. So future manned missions to the moon. So the idea was we want to go back to the moon with manned missions to study it, in ways that robotics can't exactly, and to establish a presence on the moon, a manned laboratory. Japanese Space Agency, European Space Agency, Russian Space Agency, Israeli Space Agency, and Indian Space Agency have all announced plans to go back to the moon. The only one that didn't was NASA, okay, until actually, interestingly enough, President Trump said he wants us to go back to the moon. Okay, and so NASA, was taken off the list. Now they're back on the list. Okay, because now the President Trump has said we're going to go back to the moon, and he's directed NASA to start working to go back to the moon. In the meantime, there are some private companies that are planning to go to the moon. German Space Agency, or rather LuxSpace, a German company, actually they worked with Israel, but they also worked with Chinese. So the Chang'e 3 mission in 2014 actually had a payload that was paid to go along on the trip by this German company. Okay. They're not the only sort of thing here. International crewed missions. So again, Russia wants to go back in 2025 to orbital mission and actually land in the 2030s. China's planning on landing in the 2030s. Japan's planning on landing in the 2030s. These are all manned missions. Okay. Now, notice the earliest one here is 2025, just orbital, and 2030s for landing. So there are some other private ones here. American company called Astrobotic Technology plans to launch a private lander to the moon, unmanned lander, that they have tentatively set as late next year as the landing. SpaceX wants to go. They announced in 2017 that they were going to have a 6-day circumlunar flight, so a flight to the moon and back. And they originally said they're going to do it in late 2018, and they've more recently postponed it to late 2023. But as far as I can tell, they still don't have a rocket capable of doing that exactly, so they may have to postpone it a little bit later than that even. But they already have a paying passenger. A multi-millionaire from Japan has already paid for tickets. And so so they want to do this. My guess is that flight around the moon is going to be pushed back later. But, as I said, President Trump authorized NASA to quit what they were doing under the Obama administration and go back to the moon. And so they've actually got a plan now to launch a orbital flight to and back to the moon, a manned mission in 2023, and then with a landing in 2024. Now, this is very short time frame, and I don't really think they'll be able to do this, though they keep saying they're going to be able to do it. But they're trying to beat the Russians to the moon, obviously, is what they're trying to do. But this is very ambitious.